It was supposed to be a peaceful road trip to visit family, just the two of us, Peter and Jessica, cruising through the remote mountain passes of Wyoming. We'd been on the road for hours, the quiet of the mountains wrapping around us, and we stopped at a scenic overlook to take a few photos. The mountains stretched endlessly, their peaks dusted with snow, and the air was crisp, sharp, perfect for a short break. Peter was busy adjusting his camera, capturing the view, and I stood by the car, enjoying the silence. It was beautiful, peaceful, or it was until I heard it, the sound of footsteps, not animal or the wind. These were heavy, deliberate steps coming from the trees. It was like something, or someone was moving through the brush, and the noise was too distinct, too real to ignore. "Peter, do you hear that?" I asked, my voice low, unsure. He looked up from his camera, squinting toward the trees. "Probably just a deer," he said, dismissing it, but I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't a deer, not with those thudding steps. I turned my attention back to the trees, and that's when I saw it. A figure, large, dark. It moved between the trunks, its shape impossibly big. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but there was something off about it. It wasn't just the size. It was how it moved, walking upright, like a man, but far too large, far too broad. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed Peter's arm. "Peter, look." He followed my gaze, his expression changing instantly. His hand gripped the camera so tight I thought he might break it. But before either of us could react, the creature stepped out from behind the trees and onto the road. It was massive, standing well over 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur, with broad shoulders and a hunched back. It stared at us with glowing eyes, a deep growl rumbling from its chest. I swear I could feel the vibrations in the air. Its presence was overwhelming. I froze, my mind racing. What was it? A bear, a man, but no, it was something else entirely. Peter, still in shock, barely seemed to register what was happening before his instincts kicked in. "Get in the car," he shouted, already halfway to the driver's side door. I didn't wait. I was in the passenger seat before I could even think. Peter slammed the door shut and started the engine, his foot pressing hard on the gas. We shot forward, tires screeching against the asphalt, but as we looked back, we saw the creature. Its glowing eyes locked onto us through the rear-view mirror. I swear, for a moment, it was right behind us, keeping pace with the car. The growl echoed in the silence, low and guttural, and the car seemed to shake under its intensity. We pushed harder on the accelerator, the mountains blurring around us, but I could still feel that presence, that weight. Eventually we rounded a bend, and when I glanced back again, the creature was gone. The rear-view mirror was empty. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. I don't know if either of us could really process what had just happened. Even now, months later, I still can't quite believe it, but I know what I saw. We both do. There's something in those mountains. Something no one talks about, and I think it's better that way. Carla and I had been on the road for what felt like forever. A long drive across Utah, the kind of drive where the miles blur together, and the only sounds are the hum of the tires and the occasional murmur of the radio. We needed a break, something to stretch the legs, a chance to breathe in the crisp, cold air. So we pulled off at a small rest area along Highway 17. An isolated stretch of road we'd driven countless times before. But something about it felt different that night. Maybe it was the quiet. It was so still, unnaturally still. I've been on quiet stretches of highway before, but this, it felt like the kind of silence you could almost feel pressing against you. "Let's just take a quick break," Carla said, her voice breaking the tension. She was right. We needed it. We stepped out of the car and the chill of the night air hit us. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the dark landscape. I leaned against the car for a minute, inhaling the fresh air. That's when I noticed something strange: large tracks, deep impressions in the dirt near the edge of the pull-off. "Those don't look like any animal tracks I've seen before," I muttered, crouching down to get a closer look. The prints were far too large, the shape off, like something walking on two legs, but the size, it was the kind of thing that should have belonged to something out of a nightmare. Carla stood a few feet away, looking around. "Maybe a bear," she said, but her voice was tight. I wasn't so sure. We both heard it at the same time, a rustling in the trees, soft at first but growing louder, like something moving quickly through the brush. I stood up, scanning the dark shadows of the forest. Whatever it was, it wasn't just an animal. "Mark, do you see that?" Carla whispered, her voice trembling. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. There was a shape moving between the trees, something tall and dark. It moved silently, too quickly to be anything human, but it was far too large to be an animal. My heart started racing. "Stay here," I said, my voice low, trying to keep calm. I started to step forward, squinting into the darkness. I wanted to get a closer look. Maybe I could figure out what it was, make sense of it. But before I could move any closer, I heard a sharp crack, like a branch breaking, and then, without warning, it charged. The creature, a massive shadow, came out of the trees at a speed I couldn't comprehend. It was so fast, so powerful. I didn't even have time to react before it barreled toward us. I barely managed to leap out of the way, stumbling backward as the ground shook under its weight. I saw its eyes, glowing faintly, just for a second before it was gone. The air was thick with its presence, and I could feel the ground tremble as it retreated back into the trees. "Get in the car," I shouted, my voice panicked as I rushed back to Carla, who was already frozen in place. Her face was pale and her eyes were wide with terror. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the car. We scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I started the engine. The tires spun against the gravel as we sped away, the headlights casting long beams of light into the night. For miles we didn't say anything. The silence was overwhelming. I could barely focus on the road, my mind racing. Had we just imagined it? But no, the look on Carla's face told me it wasn't a dream. When we finally stopped at a gas station a few miles down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I saw it. Large, muddy handprints smeared across the mirror. It was like the creature had been right there, watching us as we drove away. Carla looked at me, her voice barely a whisper. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't alone on that highway. And whatever it was still out there waiting. Tom and I had been driving for hours, winding through the desert roads of Arizona. The Grand Canyon was just ahead, a place we'd always talked about visiting but never quite found the time to. We were making the most of our cross-country trip, taking in the views and soaking in the silence of the vast, barren landscape. We pulled off the road, our tires crunching on the gravel as we came to a stop near one of the canyon's many lookout points. The air was dry, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows over the jagged cliffs. It was beautiful, in an overwhelming way, almost like staring into an abyss that stretched on forever. "Let's get out and stretch," Tom said, already reaching for the door. We both stepped out of the car, the warmth of the day fading as the cool evening air rushed in. I walked toward the edge of the canyon, my eyes drifting down into the vast gorge below. The cliffs fell away in an impossible drop, and the shadows cast by the setting sun made the canyon seem even more daunting. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a flicker, something large moving among the rocks far below. My heart skipped a beat as I focused on the shape, trying to make sense of it. It was massive, moving in and out of the shadows, but it wasn't the shape of a bear or a mountain lion. No, it was something much larger, something that didn't belong. "Tom," I said, my voice tight, "look down there." He turned, glancing toward the canyon's depths, but he didn't seem to see it. "What? It's just a bear or something," but I couldn't take my eyes off it. The shape was too big, too fast. It moved with purpose, and I could sense its presence even from this distance. "No, that's too big to be a bear." Tom laughed a little dismissively. "You're just seeing things. It's probably a boulder or some trick of the light. Come on, let's get going. We've got more ground to cover." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The figure in the canyon had seemed off, almost unnatural, and now that Tom had turned his attention back to the car, I could feel it in the air, an oppressive tension, like the earth itself was holding its breath. I took a step back, my eyes still fixed on the canyon below, trying to figure out what I had seen. That's when I heard it. A deep, resonant crack, like the sound of something large breaking through thick brush. I froze. The air felt still, unnaturally so, and then came the roar. The roar echoed through the canyon, vibrating through the earth, rattling my bones. It was guttural, primal, like nothing I had ever heard before. The ground seemed to tremble beneath me, and I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever it was coming closer. "Tom," I whispered urgently, turning toward him, but he was already looking in the same direction. His face had gone pale. It was close now, a massive shape, crashing through the brush, moving toward us with terrifying speed. Its form was too dark to make out clearly, but I could see enough to know that this was no ordinary creature. It was huge, far larger than anything I had ever imagined. The roar came again, shaking the very air around us, and I felt a surge of panic. "Get in the car," I shouted, but Tom was already moving, his legs almost stiff with fear. We both rushed to the car, fumbling with the door handles, as the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder. I barely managed to slam the door shut before Tom hit the gas, and the car lurched forward, kicking up dust as we tore down the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature right behind us, but it was still back there, hidden in the shadows of the canyon. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. Our hearts were racing, adrenaline pumping through our veins. The car was silent except for the sound of our breath. Tom was gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles were white. "We're not going back there," I said quietly, my voice shaking. He didn't answer at first. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "I don't know what that was," he said finally, his voice hoarse, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." Neither of us said anything else for the rest of the drive. We were both too shaken. Whatever it was we saw in that canyon, whatever had been stalking us, was still out there. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. We thought we had it all figured out, just a road trip through Northern California, the kind of trip everyone dreams of, full of wide open roads, breathtaking views, and endless possibilities. But things took a turn. It happened on a deserted stretch of road. Justin and I had been driving for hours, the landscape stretching out in all directions with no sign of civilization. The only sound was the hum of the tires on the asphalt, the occasional gust of wind rustling through the trees, the kind of peaceful, solitary place you'd expect to find in a horror movie, but we didn't think much of it at the time. That was until the car sputtered and then died. I glanced at the dashboard, seeing nothing but a dead engine and a flickering battery light. "Seriously?" I muttered under my breath, pressing my hand to the steering wheel. Justin let out a frustrated sigh. "Great, just great. No service, and we're stuck in the middle of nowhere." I tried the car again, but it was useless. No amount of turning the key or pressing the accelerator was going to fix it. So there we were, stranded with no other cars in sight and no idea how far away the next town was. We got out and started looking for a signal, walking away from the car to try and get better reception, but it was useless. No signal, not even a single bar. It was then I heard it. A distant crash, like something big had just barreled through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. The woods around us were eerily quiet, and hearing that sudden noise sent a shiver down my spine. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Justin. He was scanning the trees with a frown. "Probably just some wildlife. We're in the middle of the forest, remember." I wanted to believe him, but something didn't feel right. The sound was too deliberate, too loud to be an animal. Then I saw them. Large footprints near the back tires of our car. The print was deep in the dirt, too big to be anything I had ever seen before. My stomach twisted and I took a step back. "What the hell is that?" Justin looked down, his brow furrowing. "That's not an animal track. That's way too big." Just as he said that, the crash came again, closer this time. And then, through the trees, something huge moved toward us. I froze. My eyes locked onto the dark silhouette breaking through the foliage. It was massive, and the way it moved, like a force of nature, sent waves of dread crashing over me. I couldn't make out its exact shape, but it was big, way too big for a bear or any other creature I knew. "Get in the car!" I screamed, panic rising in my throat. Justin didn't hesitate. He was already pulling at the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the handle. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush, getting closer, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground beneath our feet. The engine sputtered to life when Justin tried to start the car, but it immediately died again, as if mocking us. He hit the steering wheel, desperate. Come on, please," but the engine wouldn't cooperate. I turned and saw the creature stepping out of the trees, a hulking shadow towering over us. It was at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, an unnatural, malevolent gleam. The creature let out a deep, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating in my chest. It was close now, too close. Justin started. I screamed again, my voice barely a whisper in the face of that roar. He tried once more, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, but it wasn't fast enough. The creature was nearly upon us, its massive form casting an enormous shadow over the car. Finally, with one last desperate turn of the key, the car surged forward, speeding away just as the creature lunged toward us. I could see its huge hand reaching for the car, its claws scraping against the metal. The road blurred in the headlights as we sped down the highway, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, behind us, keeping pace. The creature was fast, its huge legs moving like a blur as it chased us down the road. We drove for what felt like an eternity, every bump and turn of the road making my heart race. I could hear its howls in the distance, loud and mournful, echoing through the night. It was still following us. I don't know how long it kept up, but it felt like we were being hunted. Finally, we reached a small town, the first sign of civilization we'd seen in hours. We pulled over at the gas station, panting and shaking. Justin slammed the car in park, his hands still trembling on the wheel. Did that really just happen? I whispered, staring out into the dark road we had just traveled. "I don't know," Justin said, his voice hoarse, "but we're not going back out there." We didn't speak much after that. We both knew that whatever had been chasing us, whatever had been stalking us through the woods, was still out there, and it might still be waiting for its next victim. It was supposed to be a peaceful drive, just a simple detour to avoid the main highway. Dean and I had been exploring national parks for days, stopping at one quiet spot after another, relishing the beauty of the outdoors. But when we stumbled upon a narrow backroad near Olympic National Park, something about it felt off. We'd been driving for about an hour. the dense trees on either side of the car closing in around us. The forest was silent, almost unnervingly so. Every now and then a bird would chirp or a leaf would rustle in the wind, but the kind of sounds you expect from a place like this seemed distant, muffled. That should have been our first warning, but we pressed on, thinking it was just a quiet stretch of road. The further we went, the stranger it felt. The air seemed heavier, and there was a tension that I couldn't quite place. Claire, sitting beside me, was unusually quiet. She was staring out the window, her brow furrowed, watching the trees closely. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, her voice tight. I was too focused on the road to respond at first, but when I really listened I could hear it. It wasn't the usual hum of the forest, it was deeper, thicker, like something was moving around us, something large. The branches overhead creaked, and the ground beneath the tires rumbled as if something was just out of sight. "What do you think it is?" Claire asked, her eyes darting nervously from the trees to the rear-view mirror. "Probably a bear or something," I said, trying to sound casual, but there was an unease creeping up my spine. This is their territory after all. She didn't respond, but I could see her grip tightening on the armrest. Then, just as I turned my attention back to the road, I saw it. Something in the trees, broken branches hanging low, as if something large had pushed through them. It wasn't a bear, I realized. It was too deliberate, too unnatural. "Dint," Claire whispered, barely audible. "Look." I glanced at her, and she was staring out the passenger window, her eyes wide with fear. "There's something moving in there, something huge." I slowed the car, my heart starting to race. The forest ahead was dense, but I could see the trees shaking as if something large was moving through them. The sound of heavy footsteps, too far apart to be any kind of regular animal, began to grow louder. It was too much for me to ignore now. "Just keep driving," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're almost out of here." But the moment the words left my mouth, the car jolted. Something massive slammed into the side of the car, throwing us both against our seatbelts. My heart stopped. The entire vehicle shuddered, as if whatever it was had pushed against us with the full weight of its body. Before I could even react, a huge shape appeared in front of the car, a giant figure towering over the hood, blocking our path. I slammed on the brakes, barely stopping in time before colliding with it. The thing was massive, covered in dark, matted fur. Its face was twisted in a primal snarl, and its eyes, those eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, locking onto us with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Claire gasped, pressing herself back into the seat, her voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't speak. I could only feel the blood draining from my face as the creature moved, its steps heavy and deliberate, like a force of nature. It took a step closer, and I could hear its breathing, low and deep, vibrating in the car. I didn't know how much time passed. All I could think about was getting away. We were trapped, staring at something that shouldn't exist in the real world, and if we didn't move fast, it might not just let us go. Without thinking, I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the car screeching as I floored it. The creature didn't move at first, but when the tires finally gained traction, it stepped aside just enough to let us through. We sped off, my hands white, knuckled on the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't speak for a while, but I could feel Claire's eyes on me, both of us trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. It wasn't until we reached the main road, safe and sound, that I finally looked at her. "That thing, it wasn't a bear, was it?" She shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, that was no bear." We didn't talk much after that. We both knew, deep down, that whatever we had encountered in that forest, it was something beyond our understanding. Something that belonged to the dark corners of the world we never wanted to believe in, and we both knew that it wasn't just a one-time thing. Whatever it was out there waiting. I had never been the type to get spooked easily, but the Oregon coast was a different kind of place. The weather there was unpredictable, and the fog could roll in so thick, it felt like you were driving through a wall. But I loved the solitude. It was the perfect place to clear my head. It was late afternoon when I found myself driving down a narrow, winding road that traced the cliffs above the ocean. Fog had already begun to roll in, blanketing everything in a thick, suffocating haze. Chris, my dog, was curled up on the seat beside me, his head resting on my lap. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I didn't mind. That was when the car suddenly stalled. The engine sputtered, then cut out completely. I swore under my breath, trying to turn the key again, but the car remained stubbornly silent. I sat for a moment, staring at the fog, cursing my bad luck. There wasn't a soul around for miles, and I couldn't even see the road ahead through the thick mist. I'd have to check the engine, figure out what was wrong. Stay here, Chris, I muttered to my dog as I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out of the car. The cold, damp air hit me immediately, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. The fog swallowed everything, turning the world into a gray, featureless blur. I walked around to the front of the car, leaning down to pop the hood. But before I could even glance at the engine, Chris started barking furiously. His ears were flat against his head, and his eyes were wide with fear. He was growling now, low and guttural, a sound I rarely heard from him. "Chris, what's wrong?" I called, walking quickly back to the car, but as soon as I turned, my heart froze. A figure was emerging from the fog. At first, I thought it was just the mist playing tricks on me, but then the shape took form, moving toward me with purpose. It was large, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and it seemed to loom in the thickening fog. I couldn't make out details, but its silhouette was unmistakable. Something about it felt wrong and unnatural. Before I could react, Chris lunged out of the car, barking even louder now, his fur standing on end. He was charging straight at the figure. "Chris, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. The creature stopped, standing unnervingly still, its form barely visible now, except for the way it towered above everything else. Then, without warning, it let out a scream. A shrill, inhuman sound that echoed through the fog, rattling me to my core. My stomach dropped. The sound sent a wave of icy terror over me, and I knew, deep down, that I was not dealing with anything human. I didn't wait another second. I ran back to the car, heart pounding in my chest, and dove into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, barely managing to turn the engine over. The car roared to life, but Chris wasn't back yet. I looked over in panic, just in time to see him dart back toward the car, his paws pounding the ground as fast as he could go. The creature was still there, but it didn't move. It just watched, and that was enough. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and sped off, my tires squealing against the wet asphalt. Chris scrambled into the back seat, panting heavily, but I didn't dare look back. The fog pressed in so thick I could barely see the road, but I drove faster, my heart still racing. It wasn't until we finally reached a small town miles away that I slowed down. My hands were still trembling, and Chris was curled up in the back seat, his eyes wide and alert. I didn't stop to ask for help. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. There were no explanations, no answers. Just that fog, that figure, and the scream that still echoed in my mind, haunting me long after the mist had lifted. Molly and I were on one of those road trips that had been long overdue. We'd been talking about visiting relatives up in northern Idaho for years, and now here we were, winding down a rural road with the pine trees closing in around us. The landscape was beautiful in a way that made it feel like the world was far away from everything else. which was exactly what we needed. It wasn't until we came across that old cabin that things took an unexpected turn. We'd been driving for hours, barely passing another car, when we spotted it, a dilapidated cabin off the side of the road, nearly swallowed by the forest. It wasn't much, just a run-down shack, but there was something about it that drew me in. I'd heard the rumors, of course, the ones that said this part of Idaho had its share of strange sightings. Creatures, shadows that didn't belong, but that didn't deter me. This was a story, a mystery, and I was the kind of person who liked to explore. "Let's check it out," I said, glancing over at Molly. She wasn't one to shy away from an adventure either, even if she did raise an eyebrow. "You sure you know how these old places can be?" she replied, eyeing the cabin warily, but she didn't protest, and we pulled over. The cabin creaked as we stepped inside. The air smelled musty, and the floorboards groaned beneath our feet. The windows were covered in grime, but even with the dim light, it was clear that this place had been abandoned for years. Nothing particularly unsettling, just the usual decay of forgotten buildings. But as we started exploring the small rooms, something started to gnaw at me. It wasn't right, the stillness, the silence, the feeling that someone, or something, was nearby watching us. I tried to push it aside, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, but then I heard it, a rustling noise coming from outside. "What was that?" Molly asked, her voice low, tight with unease. "I'll check it out," Greg replied, trying to keep the fear from his own voice. He stepped cautiously outside, the door creaking behind him. I stayed by the window, my heart pounding as I watched him. The air felt thicker, the silence heavier, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. Huge footprints. Large, deep imprints in the dirt right near the cabin's edge. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. They weren't animal prints. No, these were too large, too human-like, and the way they pressed into the earth. "They didn't belong, Greg," I whispered, but my voice was too quiet, too afraid to carry. I tried to reach for the door, but before I could make it, a sharp crack sounded from behind me, the door slamming shut on its own. I spun around, panic setting in. The heavy door shook in its frame, and I could hear Greg's voice faintly from outside, but something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut. It was as if the air had shifted, the pressure building in the room. Then I saw it. A massive shape standing just outside the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then the shape moved, its eyes gleaming in the fading sunlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its form was broad, covered in thick fur. Its face was partially obscured by the shadows, but the eyes, those eyes were watching us, unblinking, as if it had all the time in the world. Greg was back now, his face pale as he tried to open the door, but it was stuck, jammed shut. He yanked harder, but it wouldn't budge. "Go, go, go!" I screamed, my voice breaking. Without thinking, I grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the window. We didn't hesitate. We ran out the back, our feet pounding against the overgrown ground, the air heavy with the scent of pine and something else, something sharp, metallic. We didn't even look back at the cabin as we made our way to the car, the engine roaring to life as we sped down the road. But just as we thought we were safe, we heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps, the sound of something running alongside us. Molly screamed. The creature was keeping up, its massive form just out of sight in the fog. We couldn't hear its breathing, but we could feel the ground tremble beneath the weight of each step it took. It stayed with us for miles, until, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The thudding of its steps faded into the distance, and the woods fell silent again. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. The cabin. The creature, the terror we'd felt, it lingered with us even now as I write this. Every creak of the house, every rustle in the trees reminds me of that place, of the thing that was watching us. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but I hope to never find out. Sophia and I had been on the road for hours, taking the long way through Missouri as part of our summer road trip. We were young, adventurous, and craving the kind of experiences you only get on long, winding back roads. It wasn't until we stumbled upon the old bridge that we realized some of those experiences are better left uncharted. The bridge was an oddity, an ancient, rusted structure standing alone over a shallow creek, tucked away down a narrow, forgotten road. The locals had warned us about it, of course. It's haunted, they'd said. People hear strange noises around it at night. Some say they've seen figures in the trees. I dismissed it at the time, assuming it was just another ghost story. But there was something about this bridge, something eerie that lingered in the air even in the daytime. Sophia had wanted to stop and snap a few pictures. She loved photography, especially capturing the kind of scenes that made her feel like she was part of some mystery. So we pulled the car off to the side, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as we got out. I took a moment to admire the view, a desolate stretch of old stonework, a relic from a time long gone. The trees around it were thick, their branches twisted and reaching like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows. It was unsettling, but in a way that felt almost too perfect for a photograph. Sophia was already setting up her camera when I heard it, a growl. Low and guttural, like something deep in the woods had just woken up. I frowned and turned toward the trees. Probably a bear, I said, trying to brush it off. I could feel my heart rate quicken, but I didn't want to scare her. Sophia gave me a skeptical look. A bear? That didn't sound like a bear. I laughed nervously, but even I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We both stood still for a moment, the growl fading into the distance, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. I shrugged it off and turned back to the bridge, trying to focus on the view. That's when it happened. There was a rustling in the trees, followed by a deep, loud snap of branches. My heart stopped as I turned to look. From the shadows of the forest, something massive emerged, a huge, dark shape moving with unnatural speed. My breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but this was no bear. This was something far bigger, something that didn't belong. It was covered in thick, matted hair, its body hulking and broad. The way it moved fast and purposeful was more like a predator on the hunt. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel the danger radiating from it. Sophia grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "Jordan, we need to go, now." I didn't need to be told twice. We rushed back to the car, adrenaline pumping through my veins. As I threw open the door and slammed it shut, I could hear the creature growling again, this time much closer, its heavy footfalls crashing through the underbrush. I slammed the keys into the ignition, the engine roaring to life as I floored the gas pedal. Behind us I could hear the creature gaining ground, its growls vibrating through the air, its massive form chasing us down. The rear-view mirror was a blur of dark trees and flashes of movement, and I could almost feel the creature's presence just inches from our car. Its footsteps were thunderous, relentless, as if it was right on our tail. We didn't look back. I kept the accelerator pressed to the floor, the tires screeching as we tore down the road. Every inch of my body tense with the fear that it might leap onto the back of the car at any moment. The growls grew fainter as we picked up speed, but I could still feel the weight of its pursuit. It wasn't until we'd reached a safer distance, a few miles down the road, that the sounds finally faded into silence. Sophia was trembling beside me, her face pale. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, still too stunned to answer. I didn't have a name for whatever we had just encountered, but I knew one thing for sure. We had narrowly escaped something we weren't meant to see. Something that roamed the forests of Missouri, waiting for its next victim. The rest of the drive was a blur, neither of us saying much. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that dark shape looming behind us. But there was nothing. Just the empty, winding road. We never stopped for a picture of that bridge again, and I don't think we'll ever forget the growls that followed us out of those woods. It was one of those quiet nights where everything seemed to slow down. Matt and I were just two friends, out on a late night drive, making our way through the backroads of Kentucky. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the winding country roads. We were trying to shake off the stress of the week, nothing more than the peaceful hum of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional chirp of crickets filling the air. Or at least that's what it should have been. The night had a strange, unnerving stillness to it, but I chalked it up to the remoteness of the area. There were no other vehicles for miles, just us, a stretch of road, and the vast woods surrounding us. Matt kept chatting about random things, but even he seemed to sense that something was off, though neither of us said it aloud. We decided to take a detour, looking for some new route to explore, and that's when we stumbled across it. An old dirt road barely wide enough for a car to pass. It looked inviting, mysterious even, like it had stories to tell. But as we drove deeper into the woods, I noticed the eerie silence that surrounded us. Even the air seemed thicker, more oppressive. The road suddenly stopped, blocked by fallen trees. Large, jagged branches were piled high, making it impossible to pass. We could see nothing beyond the barrier except the darkness of the trees stretching out, endless and foreboding. "Guess we'll have to turn back," Matt said, shrugging. He wasn't bothered by the deed, or it was just another one of our little adventures after all. But I felt a strange pull, as if the road was calling to us to see what lay beyond it. "Let's move the branches," I suggested, my voice almost too eager. "It'll only take a minute. Who knows, maybe we'll find something interesting." Matt rolled his eyes but agreed. We got out of the car and began pushing the thick branches aside. The trees were older here, their bark gnarled and twisted, like they'd been standing guard for centuries. The air felt colder, too, an odd chill that prickled the back of my neck. That's when we heard it, a sound that stopped us dead in our tracks. Heavy footsteps. Too heavy to be a deer, too deliberate to be the wind. They were slow but purposeful, moving closer, one after the other, growing louder with each passing second. I turned to Matt, but his face was pale, his mouth agape in disbelief. "I don't see anything," Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. The footsteps grew closer, closer still, but we couldn't see anything in the dark. It felt like we were being watched, like something unseen was standing just beyond the tree line, waiting for us to make a move. The hairs on my arms stood on end as a cold sweat formed on the back of my neck. Then, without warning, it stepped out of the woods. A massive figure, far larger than anything I'd ever seen before, emerged from the trees. It wasn't just big, it was colossal, towering above us like a creature from a nightmare. Its fur was dark, blending into the shadows, and its eyes. Those eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow hue. I couldn't even process what I was seeing. It was just too unreal, too horrifying. A roar echoed from the creature's throat, deep and bone, shaking, vibrating the air around us. Matt froze, his hand still gripped on the branch, but his body rigid with terror. My heart pounded, and for a second I couldn't move, couldn't think. It was like my body had forgotten how to function. Instinct took over first, though. Get in the car, now. I screamed, dragging Matt toward the vehicle. We scrambled into the car, slamming the doors shut just as the creature moved toward us, its massive form blocking the road completely. I fumbled with the keys. hands shaking uncontrollably as I tried to start the engine. My breath came in ragged gasps as I glanced in the rear-view mirror. Still no sign of the road behind us, just darkness. I put the car in reverse, but the creature wasn't backing off. It was too close, too fast, too powerful. Its eyes locked onto ours as it let out another guttural growl, this time accompanied by a low, menacing rumble from deep within its chest. "Go, go, go," Matt shouted, his voice sharp with panic. I pressed the gas pedal as hard as I could, the tires screeching as we shot forward, racing away from the creature's menacing presence. For a split second, I thought it might chase us, but to my shock, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing just as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the car still shaking with the adrenaline coursing through my body. I glanced over at Matt, both of us breathing heavily, our minds trying to process what had just happened. We were silent for the rest of the drive, too shaken to speak. As we finally reached the main highway and the lights of civilization, I couldn't shake the image of those glowing yellow eyes. Whatever it was that we encountered in those woods, it wasn't just a figment of our imagination. We had come face to face with something out of the ordinary, a creature that didn't belong in this world, and we weren't ever going back. The engine of Vince's truck hummed steadily as it rolled down the empty highway, the monotonous sound of the tires on asphalt blending with the distant echoes of the night. The Pacific Northwest was known for its vast, impenetrable forests, and tonight they felt even more suffocating than usual. Darren sat next to Vince in the cab, sipping his coffee, eyes half, closed from exhaustion. "We should pull over for a bit," Vince muttered, wiping his tired eyes. "I can barely keep my eyes open. We've been driving for hours." Darren, who had been nodding off for most of the trip, agreed with a tired grunt. The long stretch of road ahead appeared isolated and desolate, shrouded in thick darkness, the trees pressing in on either side like silent, watching sentinels. They came upon a small rest area tucked away at the side of the highway, illuminated only by a dim streetlight. The truck rumbled to a stop, and the two men stepped out, stretching their stiff limbs after hours on the road. The air was thick with the smell of pine, the silence oppressive. There was no sign of life, no other vehicles around. Just the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The forest seemed to envelop the area, its presence looming like a dark, whispering entity. "Feels weirdly quiet here," Darren commented, glancing nervously at the trees that seemed to shift in the darkness. Vince looked up at the stars, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up on him. He'd heard stories about the forests around here, local legends of something that roamed the woods at night, something that never let its prey escape. But those were just stories, right? Just as they were about to return to the truck, they heard it. A sharp snap of a twig in the distance, followed by another, then another. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. Something was moving in the woods. Vince froze, his gaze flicking to the tree line. He couldn't make out anything, but the hair on the back of his neck stood up. Darren, sensing the tension, turned to him. "What's that?" "I don't know," Vince muttered, his voice low. "Could be an animal." But as the sound of heavy movement drew closer, their unease grew. The forest seemed to be alive, as though the very trees were leaning in, watching them. Then, through the thick shadows, something large moved among the trees. A hulking shape that was too big, too fast, to be just a deer or a bear. Vince's heart skipped a beat. He grabbed Darren's arm, pulling him back. "Get inside the truck, now." But before they could make it, the creature emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint light cast by the street lamp. It was massive, towering over them easily 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with a terrifying amber hue. Its face, was hidden in the shadows of its matted hair, but the unmistakable shape of its hulking frame sent a chill down Vince's spine. The creature growled low, a sound so deep it vibrated the air around them. It bared its teeth-sharp, yellowed fangs, and took a step toward them. Instincts kicked in, and Vince shoved Darren toward the truck. "Go," he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. The two men scrambled into the cab, slamming the door behind them just as the creature charged. It was faster than they had expected, its feet pounding the earth like a force of nature, its breath a low, guttural growl that seemed to shake the truck. "Go, go," Vince yelled, his hands fumbling for the keys. Darren was still frozen in fear, staring out the window at the massive figure moving ever closer. The creature reached the truck, slamming a massive paw against the side with a terrifying force. Vince finally got the engine running, and the truck roared to life. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, peeling out of the rest area and speeding back down the highway. In the rear-view mirror, they could see the creature standing at the edge of the forest, watching them with glowing eyes as they drove away. It didn't follow, not immediately, but Vince had the distinct feeling that it was waiting, lurking in the shadows. The road stretched on, and the further they drove, the more the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving a cold, creeping fear behind. Neither Vince nor Darren spoke for a long while, the weight of the encounter pressing on them, heavier than the truck itself. It wasn't until they made a stop at a gas station hours later, the tension still thick in the air, that they noticed it. Large, deep gouges on the side of the truck, claw marks, jagged and fresh. Both men stared at the marks, the realization sinking in like lead. "It's real," Darren said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Vince swallowed, his throat dry. "Yeah, it's real." And in that moment, neither of them had any doubt that whatever it was they'd encountered out there in the woods, it wasn't something they'd ever forget. The forest stalker was out there, waiting for its next encounter, and no matter how far they drove, they knew it could always find them.